I think for the most part, we can all agree that science tells us how things work, but it requires religion for us to have an understanding for why things are the way they are. What is the purpose? And I want to go a little bit deeper than this comment here. And I want to point out that when it comes to religious interpretations of things, that really is highly dependent on your perspective. Let me give you a couple very relevant examples. When it comes to where the scripture says, don't call anybody your father. Now, the Orthodox would say, well, that is a figurative statement. That's not being literal. But the Protestants would say, no, that's very literal. You're not allowed to say that, and you're not allowed to call anybody a father. And so you could say, well, who's right? One says it's figurative, the other one says it's literal. Let me give you an example. In Orthodoxy, for example, they say, well, we use tradition. That's how we know how to interpret Scripture, what's literal and what's figurative. And let me give you an example that I think you're going to find very poignant. When it comes to communion or the Eucharist, a good example there is Solomon's Temple. So with Solomon's Temple, before it was dedicated, it was just stone and material and metal and so forth. But after it was dedicated, Solomon's Temple was the house of the Lord. Now, there was no chemical changes. Nobody is going to argue that there were any chemical changes or physical changes to the building before and after the dedication. It literally was physically, materialistically identical, but at one time it was the house of the Lord, and before that it wasn't. But it literally was the house of the Lord, even though there were no material changes. And so when it comes to the Eucharist or communion, the interpretation with the Orthodox is it's exactly the same. That's how I interpret their perspective anyway, is that it literally is. You're not going to go up and do a chemical test of the Eucharist and say, oh, look, it's really just bread and wine. No, it is just bread and wine if you did a chemical test. But before and after, sometime in between, just like Solomon's Temple, at some point it became the house of the Lord. And at some point when you're doing the Eucharist, it becomes the blood and body of Christ, which is why the early Christians were accused of being cannibals, because of this doctrine that they had, that it literally was the body and blood of Christ. And it comes down to, again, perspective. And you might say, well, that's a big deal to me. And I would say, I'm not sure that makes any difference to salvation. Maybe you think it does. I don't. It's an issue of perspective. What actually is important for salvation? It's a completely different topic, in my opinion, but maybe you disagree. And again, that's just perspective, isn't it?